The heat in Coyote Bend did not just press down. It seeped in. It was a physical weight on the shoulders, a dry rasp in the throat. The Arizona sun beat the land into a state of perpetual surrender, baking the earth until it cracked and turned the color of rust. Red dust, fine as flour, settled on everything. It coated the rough-hewn planks of the boardwalk, filmed the windows of the mercantile, and left a faint, gritty taste on the tongue. A wind, too tired and hot to offer any relief, stirred the dust into lazy swirls and carried the smells of the town cheap soap from the boarding house, hot metal from the blacksmith's forge, and the ever-present scent of horse and sun-baked leather from the edge of town. The groan and hiss of a steam engine was a constant reminder of why Coyote Bend existed at all, its iron wheels hauling away the silver and lumber that were the town's lifeblood. Eloise's heart knew the sound of that train better than her own heartbeat. It was the rhythm of her life, a promise of a world beyond the dust, a world she had no time to consider. At 24, her world was the small, stifling examination room behind Dr. Adams' office. Today, it smelled of carbolic acid and the faint, sweet odor of blood. She was changing the dressing on a miner's hand, a man whose argument with a blasting cap had left him with 2 fewer fingers and a profound new respect for fuses. Her movements were economical and sure, her touch gentle but firm. The man, a burly Cornishman with a beard full of rock dust, winced as she cleaned the wound. "Easy there, Miss Hart," he grumbled, though there was no real heat in his voice. "Hold still, Samuel, and it will be over sooner," Eloise replied, her voice calm and even. "Dr. Adams says you were lucky. It could have been the whole hand." "Luck's a funny thing," the miner muttered, staring at the empty space where his fingers had been. "Feels a lot like carelessness from where I'm sitting." Eloise tied off the bandage, her fingers deft and practiced. A thin, silvery scar, no wider than a thread, coiled around her own wrist, a pale line against her sun-browned skin. She was no stranger to the mines or the men they broke. Her father had been one of them, swallowed by a collapse when she was 16. She had been there that day, helping pull the men out. That was how she'd gotten the scar, from a sharp edge of rock as she'd reached for a survivor's hand. It was a part of her now, a reminder that life in this territory was paid for in flesh and bone. Her father had left her nothing but his name and a pile of debts that the mining company, and its owner, never let her forget. So she worked for the doctor, a temporary nurse whose position had become quietly permanent, patching up the men who went down into the dark each day. She rinsed her hands in the basin, the water already lukewarm. Through the window, she could see the main street shimmering in the heat. A carriage, far too opulent for Coyote Bend, was pulling up in front of the land office. It was lacquered black with wheels picked out in gold, drawn by a pair of perfectly matched gray horses that looked as out of place as a diamond in a dustpan. Silas Barron stepped out. He was a man built of money, from the shine on his polished boots to the glint of the watch chain strung across his brocade vest. He owned the railroad, the largest silver mine, and more land than any 10 men in the territory. He moved with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been told no, his smile a flash of white that never reached his cold, assessing eyes. He was handsome, in the way a well-made rifle is handsome, all sleek lines and polished surfaces, with the clear promise of detached violence. He wanted to own the whole valley, including the water that trickled down from the Apache lands in the mountains, the very water that kept Coyote Bend from turning to a ghost town. Trailing him like a well-fed shadow was Judge Horace Avery. The judge was a man softened and rounded by drink and compromise, his face perpetually flushed. He carried the law in a leather-bound book, but everyone in Coyote Bend knew that his gavel fell wherever Silas Barron's shadow landed. Barron owned the judge as surely as he owned his mines, and he used the law as just another tool, a hammer to shape the world to his liking. Eloise watched them, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. They were the architects of this town's fortune and its misery, and she knew, with the certainty of a coming storm, that their ambitions would not be satisfied until they owned everything, including the people. "Sun's hot enough to fry an egg on a saddle out there," Samuel the miner said, flexing his bandaged hand. "Reckon Barron's looking to buy the sun next." Eloise offered a small, tired smile. He'd find a way to sell the light back to us at a profit. The conversation died as she helped him to his feet. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or pointless worry. Worry was a luxury, like lace or cool water. She had work to do. Miles away, in the sparse shade of a juniper tree high in the rocky hills overlooking the town, Nietzsche watched the same black carriage. His stillness was absolute, less a choice and more a state of being, like a hawk resting on a thermal. He saw the world in details others missed: the nervous flick of a horse's ear in the heat, the way the red dust rose and fell with the passage of a lone rider, the shimmer of heat that blurred the distant mountains. He saw the train, a black scar of smoke against the vast, pale sky, and knew it as a relentless invader, cutting the land, carrying away its bones. He had once worn the blue coat of the cavalry, serving as a scout, believing in the possibility of a bridge between two worlds. He learned their language, their ways, their lies. He had left after the Clear Creek incident, after watching promises turn to ash and treaties become excuses for theft. He had turned his back on their world, but he had not forgotten how it worked. He carried the discipline of that life with him, but it was now bent to a different purpose: the protection of his people and the land that had birthed them. The whispers in Coyote Bend called him dangerous. They said he was as dangerous as sin. The words amused him. Sin, in his experience, was usually loud, boastful, and dressed in fine clothes. It drove a black carriage. What they called danger, he called survival. What they called sin, he called loyalty to the earth and the spirits of his ancestors. He was a man of few words, preferring the language of the wind and the tracks left in the dust. He had come down from the valley not for trouble, but for salt and news. Trouble, however, had a way of finding you, whether you went looking for it or not. His gaze drifted from Barron's carriage to the center of town, where the public well stood. He saw the slow procession of townsfolk, the buckets rising and falling. Water was life. It was the one law that even men like Barron could not write or unwrite, and it was the reason Barron was meeting with the judge. The railroad baron wanted to dam the Rio Bonito, to choke the life from the valley and force the last of the Apache from their ancestral homes. Nietzsche's hand rested on the braided leather reins of his horse, his thumb tracing the intricate pattern. Each strand in the braid was a part of the whole: family, land, freedom. If one broke, the whole was weakened. Later that afternoon, Eloise's errands took her to the mercantile. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and bolts of calico. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, was fanning herself behind the counter, her face set in a permanent state of disapproval. "That man," she said, nodding toward the street where Barron was now holding court with the mayor, "buys up everything that ain't nailed down. And if it is nailed down, he buys the nails." "It's his town, Martha. We just live in it," said a rancher leaning against the counter. "It ain't his water," Eloise said, her voice quiet but clear. The men in the store turned to look at her. It was not like Eloise's heart to offer an opinion on such matters. "Not yet. Anyway," the rancher grunted, tipping his hat to her as he left. She bought what she needed: bandages, thread, and a small bag of peppermint candies she kept for the children who came to the doctor's office. As she stepped back onto the boardwalk, the heat felt even more oppressive. She saw Nietzsche then. He was standing across the street, in the shadows of the livery stable. He was not looking at her, but she felt his presence like a change in the air pressure before a storm. She had only seen him from a distance before, a lean, solitary figure on a paint horse. Up close, he was taller than she'd imagined, with the stark, high-boned features of his people. He wore denim trousers and a plain cotton shirt, but he wore them with a dignity that made Silas Barron's expensive suit look like a costume. He was watching the comings and goings of the town with an unnerving, silent intensity. The rumors, she thought, had gotten one thing right. There was something dangerous about him, but it was not the wild, uncivilized danger the town gossip spoke of. It was a coiled, disciplined strength, a quiet refusal to bend. He looked, she thought with a start, like a man who had never been owned by anyone. He looked like sin, yes, but perhaps not the kind the preachers warned of. Perhaps he looked like the sin of defiance. He turned his head then, and for a single, breath-stopping moment, his eyes met hers across the dusty street. His gaze was dark and direct, holding no judgment, no artifice, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. It was as if he saw straight through the tired nurse and the miner's orphan, and saw the woman underneath, the one who was just as trapped by this town as any bird in a cage. The moment stretched, a silent conversation in the oppressive heat. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned, melting back into the shadows of the stable. Eloise stood frozen for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bag of supplies suddenly felt heavy in her arms. The red dust swirled at her feet, and the long, mournful whistle of the train sounded, pulling its load of silver away into the vast, indifferent desert. A chill, entirely unrelated to the heat, traced its way down her spine. Something was about to break in Coyote Bend. She could feel it, the way she could feel the coming of a fever, and she had the terrible, certain feeling that she, the well, and the quiet Apache who looked like sin were all standing at the center of it. The summons came the next morning. It was not a polite request, but a stark, legal command, delivered by a deputy who could not meet her eyes. Eloise's heart was to present herself at the courthouse at noon. No reason was given. Only the weight of Judge Avery's signature at the bottom of the page. Dr. Adams protested, claiming his nurse was essential. But the deputy just shrugged. A man following orders he did not care to understand. A knot of ice formed in Eloise's stomach. This had the feel of Silas Barron's handiwork, swift and cold and absolute. The courthouse was not busy. In fact, it was nearly empty, which was more unnerving than a crowd. The usual loiterers and petitioners were absent. Only Silas Barron sat in the front row, looking as comfortable as if he were in his own drawing room. Judge Avery was on the bench, shuffling papers with a show of great importance. Two of Barron's men, rough-looking men who usually worked security at the mine, stood by the door. The trap had been set, and she had just walked into it. "Miss Hart," Judge Avery began, his voice attempting a tone of solemn authority, "we are here to address a matter of some delicacy, a matter of outstanding debt." Eloise stood before the bench, her hands clasped in front of her to still their trembling. "I have no debts. Your Honor, I pay my way." Barron gave a low, theatrical sigh from his seat. "A commendable sentiment, my dear, but this is not your debt. It is your father's." A clerk, a nervous young man with spectacles, pushed a ledger across the table. It was a mine ledger, detailing supplies, advances, and expenses charged against Thomas Hart's name. The numbers were fantastical, inflated beyond all reason. It was a work of fiction written in ink. "This is a lie," Eloise said, her voice shaking with a rage that burned away her fear. "My father was a careful man. He would never have owed such a sum." "The ledger says otherwise," Judge Avery said, tapping the book with a fleshy finger. "And the law is clear. Debts against an estate must be settled. As his only heir, the responsibility falls to you." "I have no estate to speak of," Eloise retorted, her gaze locking with Barron's. "I have nothing." "Ah, but you do," Barron said, rising and approaching the bench. He moved with a predator's grace. "You have yourself a valuable asset. I assure you," he smiled at her, a chilling expression devoid of warmth. "I have a proposal, one that is both generous and lawful. I will assume the entirety of the Hart debt. I will consider it paid in full. In exchange, you will become my wife." The air left Eloise's lungs. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. It was preposterous. It was barbaric. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I am always serious when it comes to business," Barron said smoothly. "And this is a business arrangement. A merger, if you will." "Judge Avery," Eloise pleaded, turning to the man on the bench, "you cannot allow this. This is not law. This is coercion." The judge cleared his throat. Avoiding her eyes, he began to drone, citing obscure territorial statutes, twisting the language of inheritance and contract law into a monstrous new shape. He spoke of a woman's duty, of property and chattel, of the legal framework that allowed for the settlement of debt through binding personal contracts. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her freedom. "Therefore," Avery concluded, his voice rising, "by the authority vested in me by this territory, I find that Mr. Barron's offer is a legal and binding method for the dissolution of the debt. The contract of marriage, once entered, will satisfy the claim." He banged his gavel, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "It is so ordered." At that exact moment, a scream tore through the afternoon quiet from the square outside. It was followed by the frantic shouting of men and the terrifying sound of a horse in a blind panic. Everyone in the courtroom froze. The deputy by the door peered out, his face going pale. "It's the mayor's boy," a horse bolted from the hitching post. Through the courthouse window, Eloise saw a scene of pure chaos. A large bay gelding, its eyes wide with terror, was bucking and rearing in the middle of the street. A small boy, no older than 5, lay directly in its path, having been knocked from the boardwalk. The horse's hooves, shod in iron, were coming down like hammers. The crowd scattered, men shouting uselessly, a woman fainting. No one moved to help. The risk was too great. And then a figure moved with impossible speed and calm. It was Naichi. He seemed to emerge from the very shadows of the livery stable, not running, but flowing across the dusty ground. He did not shout or wave his arms. He moved in a low crouch, his focus absolute. The panicked horse reared again, its shadow falling over the terrified child. In that split second, Naichi was there. He caught the trailing reins in one hand, and with his other, he reached up and pressed his fingers into a specific point on the horse's neck. He used the animal's own weight and momentum against it, turning its frantic energy, guiding its head down. The horse shuddered, its eyes still wild, but the violent bucking ceased. It stood trembling, its sides heaving, its iron-shod hooves planted inches from the little boy's head. Naiche murmured something soft to the horse, in a language the townsfolk did not understand. He gentled the animal with his voice and his steady presence. Then, without a word to the stunned crowd that was now creeping forward, he led the horse back to the hitching post and secured the reins, testing the knot. He glanced once at the boy, who was now being scooped up by his hysterical mother, saw that he was unharmed, and then he simply walked away, disappearing back into the alley he had come from as if he had never been there at all. The entire event had taken less than 10 seconds. The square was silent, the onlookers staring at the empty space where the Apache had stood. They had seen something they could not easily explain or dismiss. Inside the courthouse, the spell was broken. Judge Avery, flustered by the interruption, banged his gavel again. Order, order. Eloise's mind was reeling, torn between the outrage of the verdict and the astonishing sight she had just witnessed. "The court is not finished. Miss Hart," Avery said sternly. "You have a choice. You will accept Mr. Barron's generous offer and present yourself for marriage within 7 days, or you will be remanded to the territorial jail for misuse of bailed property and contempt of this court. The choice is yours." The blood pounded in her ears. "That is no choice," she said, her voice low and fierce. "That is a prison sentence either way. You are sentencing me to slavery by ring." Barron chuckled, a sound like coins rubbing together. He stepped closer to her, his voice a proprietary murmur. "Think of it, Eloise, a life of comfort, gowns from back east, A fine house, servants, anything you desire. I desire my freedom, she shot back. His eyes narrowed, the pretense of charm falling away to reveal the cold ambition beneath. That is precisely what makes you so desirable, he said. You have spirit. You are not easily bought. I find that intriguing. I have purchased everything I have ever wanted, but I will enjoy taming something I cannot buy. The raw ugliness of his words settled over her, a suffocating shroud. She felt a profound and utter helplessness. She turned and walked numbly toward the doors, her mind a storm of disbelief and fury. She had to get out. She had to breathe. As she reached the courthouse steps, her legs felt unsteady. One of Barron's men, the one who had been guarding the door, deliberately shifted his weight, blocking her path. "Watch where you're going," he sneered. She tried to step around him, but he moved again, bumping her hard. Eloise stumbled, her balance lost, and pitched forward down the 3 wooden steps, landing in a heap in the thick red dust of the street. Her simple hat, tied with a plain ribbon, was knocked from her head and rolled a few feet away. The man laughed. Barron and Judge Avery watched from the doorway, making no move to intervene. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. She was on her hands and knees in the dirt, the object of their scorn. A pair of worn leather boots appeared in her line of sight. Slowly, she looked up. It was Nietzsche. He had not disappeared after all. He stood before her, his face impassive, his dark eyes taking in the scene. He bent down, not to help her, but to retrieve her hat. He held it for a moment, his long fingers brushing the dust from the brim. He did not look at Barron's man, did not acknowledge the judge or the railroad baron on the porch. His attention was entirely on her. He held the hat out to her. His gaze was steady, and in it, she saw not pity, but a stark, challenging expectation. Eloise hesitated, her body aching, her spirit bruised. It would be so easy to stay there, to let the tears of rage and despair come. "Stand up," Nietzsche said. His voice was quiet, a low rasp that carried no more inflection than the whisper of the hot wind. "The wind does not ask if we are ready." His words, simple and direct, cut through her shock. They were not words of comfort. They were a statement of truth, as hard and unyielding as the land itself. She looked at his outstretched hand, at the hat she had made herself, and then back into his unreadable eyes. She took a breath, pushed herself up on trembling arms, and got to her feet. She took the hat from him without a word and placed it back on her head. For a moment, they stood there, a small island of stillness in the afternoon heat. Then, from the direction of the saloon, a jeering voice called out, loud enough for half the town to hear. "Look at that judge forced her to wed a rich baron. I hear she chose the Apache who looked like sin instead." The words hung in the air, a cruel and instant summary of her new reality. The laughter that followed was coarse. The story was already taking shape, twisting her humiliation into a piece of town gossip. Her name was now irrevocably linked to the silent man who stood before her, the man who had just handed her back a small piece of her dignity. Panic was a cold, sharp thing. It drove Eloise from the dusty street, past the stunned faces of the townsfolk, and back to the small, stifling room she rented behind the doctor's office. Her hands shook as she threw her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, a change of clothes, her mother's silver locket, the small store of medical supplies she kept for emergencies, her savings, a pathetic collection of coins and bills painstakingly saved over years, were in a small tin box under her mattress. Along with it were her father's old traveling papers, thin and brittle with age. It was not much, but it was enough to buy a ticket on the midnight train, enough to get her to Prescott or even further, to a place where the names Silas Barron and Horace Avery meant nothing. She moved through the back alleys of Coyote Bend, a ghost in the deepening twilight. The setting sun bled across the horizon, setting the red dust on fire. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every distant voice felt like an accusation. The train whistle, usually a lonely sound, was now a call to salvation. Its rhythmic chuffing grew louder as she neared the station, a steady, iron heartbeat in the growing dark. The platform was nearly deserted. A few tired-looking ranchers and a family with too many children waited in the dim yellow light of the station lamps. Eloise bought her ticket from a clerk who barely glanced at her, his face a mask of boredom, with the precious slip of cardboard clutched in her hand. She felt the first flicker of hope. She could escape. She could disappear. She found a spot at the far end of the platform, melting into the shadows. The train hissed and groaned, steam billowing around its huge wheels. It was an iron beast, promising to carry her away from this nightmare. She reached into her bag to check her money and papers one last time, a nervous habit. Her fingers touched the oilcloth pouch that held her savings. It felt wrong, lighter. The familiar clink of the coins was gone, with a surge of dread. She pulled it out. Inside, instead of her carefully counted money, were a dozen flat, worthless metal slugs. Her heart stopped. Frantically, she grabbed the envelope containing her father's papers. The envelope was there, but inside, the official, stamped documents had been replaced with cut pieces of blank newsprint. Someone had been in her room. Someone had known she would run. And they had taken everything, leaving her stranded and penniless. The swap was a calculated act of cruelty. A message from Silas Barron. There was no escape. She was his property, and the entire town was his cage. The conductor's call of all aboard was a death knell. The train groaned. Wheels screeched against the rails, and with a great sigh of steam, it began to pull away from the station. Eloise stood frozen, watching the lighted windows of the passenger cars slide past her, each one a tiny portrait of a life that was not hers, a freedom she could not have. The red tail light dwindled into the vast, dark expanse of the desert until it was just another star, and then it was gone. She was alone. The station master locked the doors, doused the main lamps, and walked away, leaving her in the cold, immense silence of the Arizona night. The heat of the day had vanished, replaced by a deep, penetrating chill. She had nowhere to go. To go back to her room was to surrender. To stay here was impossible. With no other choice, she began to walk, following the tracks away from the sleeping town, into the immense, uncaring darkness. The desert at night was a different world. The familiar landscape of rock and cactus became a place of shifting shapes and strange sounds. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, and the cry of a distant coyote made her jump. She was a town woman, a healer. She knew sickness and injury, but she knew nothing of this world. The cold seeped through her thin dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She had never felt so small, so utterly lost. A sound, soft as a footstep on sand, made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure detached itself from the shadow of a tall saguaro. It was Naichi. He stood 20 feet away, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. He held the reins of his paint horse, which stood as silently as he did. He made no threatening move, yet his presence was an absolute, undeniable fact. "You are a long way from home," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried easily in the still air. "I have no home," Eloise answered, her own voice thin and brittle. He was quiet for a long moment, simply watching her. She could not see his expression in the dark. "The desert is cold for those who do not know it," he said finally. "There is shelter nearby, a place out of the wind." She stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate need. Why would he help her? What did he want? Why, she asked. "The wind does not ask why it blows," he answered, a familiar, frustrating turn of phrase. He gestured with his head. "Come or stay. The choice is yours." She had no choice. She was shivering uncontrollably, and the thought of a shelter from the biting wind was an unbearable temptation. Numbly, she followed him. He led the horse, and she walked a few paces behind, her eyes on his straight back. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, his feet making almost no sound on the rocky ground. They walked for what felt like an eternity, away from the railroad tracks, into a shallow canyon carved by forgotten rains. The shelter was a deep overhang of rock, a natural hollow in the cliff face. It was not warm, but it broke the relentless wind. In the deeper gloom, she could see a dark, damp patch on the rock wall where a trickle of water seeped through. It was a dry oasis. Nietzsche tied his horse to a hardy mesquite bush and then turned to her. In the faint starlight, his features were carved from shadow. "You can stay until morning," he said, "but I will not hide a liar. You will tell me everything. The truth." His demand was as stark and uncompromising as the landscape around them. He was offering her safety, but at a price. Not money, but honesty. She looked into his dark, steady eyes and knew he would not be fooled. He was a man who lived by a code she did not understand, but she recognized its strength, and so, huddled in the cold dark, her voice trembling at first, she told him about her father, the forged debt, the mockery of a trial, Barron's monstrous proposal, and the theft of her money. The words poured out of her, a torrent of injustice and fear. When she finished, the silence returned, deeper than before. She felt raw, exposed. She had laid the whole ugly story at the feet of this stranger, this man the town called a savage. "I am sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He tilted his head. "For what?" "For what they say about your people. In town, the rumors. I suppose I believed some of them. Before." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was no anger in his voice. Only a weary truth. "Rumors are cheaper than tobacco," he said, "but they leave a smell longer." His words, and the simple, dry way he said them, made something inside her ache. He had summed up a world of prejudice in a single sentence. A sudden cry from further down the canyon shattered the stillness. It was a cry of pain, followed by the sound of a scuffle and a man's gruff voice shouting, "He ain't got nothing. Let's finish it." Nietzsche was on his feet in an instant, his body coiled and alert. He moved to the edge of the rock shelter, peering into the darkness. Eloise followed, her own fear forgotten in the face of another's distress. In a small clearing lit by a dying campfire, two large, rough-looking men were kicking a man who was curled on the ground. They were bounty hunters, by the look of them, the kind of men who drifted from town to town, feeding on trouble. The man on the ground was black, his clothes torn, his face bloodied. Nietzsche did not hesitate. He moved out of the shelter, a silent shadow flowing over the rocks. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. The first man turned at the sound of a dislodged pebble and found Nietzsche upon him. It was not a fight. It was a swift, brutal lesson in anatomy. Nietzsche struck him twice, hard and fast, in places that made the man collapse with a choked gasp. All the fight gone out of him. The second man, startled, drew a pistol, but Nietzsche was already moving, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist. There was a sharp crack, a scream of agony, and the gun clattered to the ground. The man stumbled back, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of shocked pain. Nietzsche stood over them for a second, a figure of absolute menace in the moonlight. He said nothing. He did not have to. The two bounty hunters scrambled to their feet and fled into the night, one of them weeping in pain. Eloise rushed forward to the man on the ground. He was conscious, but barely. She knelt beside him, her medical training taking over. "It's all right," she said softly. "They're gone. Let me see." She gently turned his face to the light of the fire. He had a deep cut over his eye, and his lip was split. As she worked, opening her medical bag, Nietzsche returned. He knelt on the other side of the man, his gaze taking in the injuries. "They thought I was helping you," the man rasped, his voice thick with pain. "The woman who defied Barron. There's a notice for you, posted at the saloon." He looked from Eloise to Nietzsche. My name is Abel King. The blacksmith Eloise asked. Surprised, she knew the name. His smithy was the best in the territory. The same, Abel said, wincing as she cleaned the cut on his forehead with a cloth soaked in water from her canteen. She saw a gash on Nietzsche's forearm, a long scrape from the scuffle. You're hurt, she said to him. He glanced at it as if noticing it for the first time. It is nothing. It will get infected if it's not cleaned, she insisted. She took out her small bottle of medicinal alcohol. This will sting. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she poured the stinging liquid onto the wound. He did not flinch, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. She bandaged the arm with a clean strip of cloth. It was an intimate, practical act, an exchange of care in the heart of the wilderness. The next morning, as the sun began to warm the rocks, Nietzsche returned the favor. Abel King was resting. His injuries tended to. Eloise was thirsty, her canteen nearly empty. Nietzsche took a knife and walked to a large barrel cactus. With a few deft cuts, he carved out a section of the plant's fleshy interior. He squeezed the pulp over her canteen, and a surprising amount of clear, fresh water trickled out. This will keep you alive, he said, showing her how to identify the right kind of cactus. He showed her how a certain knot, the diamond hitch, could secure any load to a saddle, and how the direction of the wind could be read in the lean of the trees and the ripples in the sand. It was a fair exchange. She had offered him the knowledge of her world of antiseptic and bandages. He was offering her the knowledge of his of water and wind and survival. A quiet respect began to grow between them, born not of words, but of shared danger and practical skill. Later that day, a lone rider approached their camp. He was a gunslinger, a man who wore his pistol tied low and swaggered even when he was standing still. He had seen the notice in town. Heard Barron's looking for you, ma'am, the man said, his eyes flicking from Eloise to Nietzsche with open contempt. $100 for your safe return. I can offer you my protection. Get you somewhere safe. For a share of the reward, of course. I can handle this situation for you. He nodded dismissively at Nietzsche. Eloise looked at the gunslinger's confident smirk, at the casual disdain in his eyes. He saw her as a piece of property, a bag of money. He offered a version of safety, a return to the world of men like him, men like Barron. Then she looked at Nietzsche, who stood silently, watching, leaving the choice to her. He offered nothing but the harsh reality of the desert and the simple dignity of being treated as an equal. Thank you for the offer, Eloise said, her voice clear and steady. But I am not in need of your protection. I am exactly where I choose to be. The gunslinger stared at her, then at Nietzsche, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He shrugged, spat on the ground, and wheeled his horse around, riding away without another word. Eloise watched him go. The wind picked up, blowing a strand of hair across her face. She had made her choice. She had turned her back on a compromised safety and cast her lot with the quiet, dangerous man who respected her enough to let her decide. It was a terrifying choice, but for the first time since she had stood on that train platform, she felt a flicker, not just of hope, but of strength. The journey was not one of miles, but of shedding. With every step away from the iron rails and the dusty grid of Coyote Bend, Eloise felt she was walking out of a skin that no longer fit. The land changed. The flat, sun-blasted plain gave way to rolling foothills dotted with juniper and ocotillo, their spidery arms reaching for the endless sky. They climbed, following trails that were invisible to her but as clear as a map to Nietzsche. He moved with an economy of motion that made her own city-bred efforts feel clumsy and loud. He showed her how to place her feet to avoid the loose shale, how to breathe in the thin, dry air, how to listen to the silence and understand its language. After 2 days of steady travel, they reached the top of a wide, flat-topped mountain, a mesa that stood like a fortress over the surrounding territory. Nietzsche stopped at the edge and waited for her to catch up. When she stood beside him, breathing hard, She looked out, and the breath caught in her throat. Below them lay a valley, a slash of impossible green carved into the red and brown rock, a ribbon of silver, the Rio Bonito, snaked through a grove of cottonwood trees. From this height, she could see the scattered encampments of his people, wickiups like brown beehives blending into the earth, the thin plumes of smoke from their cook fires rising straight into the calm morning air. It was a place of peace, a hidden world of impossible beauty and resilience. It was his home. "This is the land of my grandfathers," Nietzsche said, his voice quiet, holding a reverence she had never heard in it before. They did not own it. They belonged to it. Barron sees only water and rock to be sold. He does not see the life within it. As they descended into the valley, a sense of being watched prickled at Eloise's skin. Faces peered out from the shelters, dark eyes following the white woman who walked beside their kinsman. There was no open hostility, only a deep, unnerving stillness, a silent questioning. Children stopped their play to stare, their expressions a mixture of fear and bold curiosity. This was harder than facing bounty hunters. This was the quiet weight of a people's history, and she was an outsider, a symbol of the world that had brought them so much pain. Nietzsche led her to a larger wickiup, set slightly apart from the others, where an older woman sat grinding mesquite beans on a flat stone. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, and her dark eyes held the calm, steady light of ancient wisdom. She looked up as they approached, her gaze taking in Eloise from head to toe. "This is Dola, my mother's sister," Nietzsche said. "She is a healer." Eloise offered a polite nod, unsure of the proper greeting. "Ma'am?" Dola said nothing. She rose slowly, her movement stiff but deliberate, and came to stand before Eloise. She looked not at Eloise's face, but at her hands. With a gentle, surprising strength, she took Eloise's right hand and turned it over, her thumb tracing the pale, silvery line of the scar on her wrist. Eloise felt a jolt, as if the woman could read the story of the mine collapse in her skin. Dola looked from the scar up to Eloise's eyes. A flicker of understanding, of recognition, passed through her own. She spoke in her own language first, soft words directed at Nietzsche. Then she turned back to Eloise and spoke in a clear, slightly accented English. "This hand knows how to save people," she said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. With those words, a wall she had not even known was there seemed to crumble. The watching eyes of the other villagers softened. The silent judgment receded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Dola had seen her, not as a white woman, not as an intruder, but as a fellow healer. She had given her a place. A man with a powerful build and a scar that cut through one eyebrow approached them. He moved with the coiled energy of a warrior, and his eyes, fixed on Eloise, were hard with suspicion. "Taza," Nietzsche said. "A simple introduction. We've fought together." Taza grunted, his gaze unwavering. "You bring a stranger among us, a white woman. The town has a price on her head. She brings trouble." "Trouble was already here," Nietzsche replied evenly. "She chose to stand against it. That is all I need to know." Taza looked from his friend to Eloise and back again. He did not look convinced, but he held his tongue, giving a curt nod before walking away. The welcome was not universal. Acceptance, Eloise realized, would have to be earned, not given. A small girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, peeked from behind Dola's skirts. She had huge, dark eyes and a solemn little face. "This is Mika," Dola said, her hand resting on the child's head. "Her parents are gone. She is a child of us all now." Mika stared at Eloise, then darted back behind the safety of Dola's legs. Eloise offered the girl a small, hesitant smile. The days that followed were a lesson in a new kind of existence. Life in the valley was a constant rhythm of work, dictated by the sun and the seasons. There was no wasted motion, no wasted time. Eloise, determined not to be a burden, asked Dola to teach her. Her first attempts were a study in failure. She tried to weave a water basket from yucca fibers, but her fingers were clumsy, the weave loose and uneven. The sharp fibers pricked her skin, and she grew frustrated as the simple, elegant shape Dola created with ease became a lopsided mess in her own hands. Dola was endlessly patient, correcting her grip, showing her how to feel the tension in the fibers after 3 days of unraveling her work and starting again. Eloise finally produced a small, tight-sewn bowl that could hold water without leaking. The pride she felt was more profound than any praise Dr. Adams had ever given her. She learned to slice venison into thin strips and hang it to dry in the sun, turning it constantly to keep the flies away. She learned to dig for yucca roots, her hands becoming calloused and strong, and how to bury them deep in the cool earth to protect them from the wind and keep them fresh. She was not an expert, not even particularly good at first, but she worked. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw, and in that work, she found a new kind of peace. She was not Eloise Hart, the nurse, the debtor, the woman sentenced to marry. She was just a pair of hands, contributing to the whole, earning her keep not with money, but with effort. And the people saw it. Taza's suspicious glances softened into grudging nods. The women began to include her in their conversations, teaching her words in their language, and Mika, the little orphan, started to follow her, leaving small gifts of pretty stones or bright feathers where she would find them. One evening, as Dola was brushing Mika's long, dark hair, she began to braid it. She took 3 strands and began to weave them together. "We braid our hair with 3 strands," she said to Eloise, who was sitting nearby, mending a tear in her dress. "One is for the family, the people who hold you. One is for the land, which feeds and shelters you. And one is for freedom, the spirit that makes you who you are." She held up the finished braid. "If one strand breaks, the braid may not fall apart, but it is weakened. It is tangled. We need all 3 to be strong." Eloise looked at the simple, beautiful braid and felt the truth of the words settle deep inside her. Barron had tried to take her freedom. The court had tried to sever her from her own name, her own family. The town had tried to take away her place in the world. Here, with these people. She was slowly, carefully, braiding those strands back together. Later, sitting by a small fire with Naiche, the comfortable silence stretched between them. The stars were brilliant in the moonless sky, so close she felt she could reach up and touch them. "My father died in a mine," she said suddenly, the words coming out before she'd planned them. A tunnel collapsed. Barron's mine. He cut corners on the support timbers to save money. Everyone knew it, but no one could prove it. I was there. I helped to pull the men out. She touched the scar on her wrist. My father died because a rich man wanted to be richer. Naiche watched the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. "I was a scout for the blue coats," he said, his voice low. "I thought I could walk in 2 worlds. I thought I could make them understand each other." He paused. "Then I watched them march a whole village, old people and children, from their homes. They had a paper, a treaty, that said the land was theirs forever. But the paper was a lie. The forever was a lie. They were being moved to a place where the ground was sour and the water was poison, so that men like Barron could have the land. I did not leave because I hated the soldiers. Some were good men, trapped by orders. I left because I hate lies. A lie is a sickness that poisons everything." His story settled beside hers in the firelight. They were from different worlds, their lives shaped by different tragedies. But they were bound by the same enemy, the casual, soul-destroying cruelty of powerful men who believed the world and everyone in it belonged to them. The next day, Naiche decided it was time she'd learn to ride properly, not on a saddle, but bareback, the way his people rode. He led her to a quiet, steady mare. "You must feel the horse," he explained. "Feel how she moves. Become a part of her." It sounded simple. It was not. Her first attempt to mount ended with her sliding ignominiously off the other side. The second time, she managed to get on, but she was stiff and awkward. The moment the horse took a step, she lost her balance and tumbled off. landing in a large, fragrant clump of sagebrush. She sat up, sputtering, covered in dust and leaves. Mika, who had been watching from a distance, giggled, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. Eloise looked up at Naichi, expecting him to laugh, but his expression was as serious as ever. "The horse does not trust one who fears herself," he said, his tone completely deadpan. The observation was so blunt, so utterly true, that Eloise could not help it. A laugh escaped her, a real, genuine laugh. The first one in what felt like a lifetime. The sound surprised even her. The moment of lightness was shattered that evening. Taza rode into the camp, his horse lathered and tired. He had been scouting the lowlands near Coyote Bend. His face was grim. "Barron has started," he said, swinging down from his horse. He looked at Naichi, but his words were for all who had gathered. "He has brought in a crew of men from the east. They are building a dam across the Rio Bonito, at the mouth of the valley. He means to choke the river. He means to steal our water." A cold silence fell over the camp. The river was their life. Without it, the valley would die, the game would leave, the crops would wither. Barron was not just trying to force them out. He was trying to erase them from the land. Eloise looked at the faces around her, at Dola's stoic calm, at Mika's frightened eyes, at Naichi's jaw, which had become a hard line of granite. Her fight for her own freedom had just become a fight for their very survival. The decision to return to Coyote Bend was born of necessity, not courage. Courage felt like a distant luxury. Dola's supply of willow bark for treating fevers was low. Taza was down to his last handful of cartridges. And the salt, used for preserving the meat that would see them through the dry season, was nearly gone. Survival was a matter of practicalities, and the practicalities were all in town, in the heart of the enemy's territory. They traveled at night, resting during the worst of the day's heat in the sparse shade of rock outcroppings. But to enter the town, they had to move in daylight, to blend with the sparse traffic of ranchers and prospectors. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the red earth until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees, a dry, suffocating heat that stole the breath and left a fine layer of dust clinging to their skin and clothes. By the time the low, familiar buildings of Coyote Bend appeared through the heat haze, Eloise felt as though she were walking back into a fever dream. The town felt different. The stares they received were no longer just curious or suspicious. They were sharp with knowledge. The story from the courthouse had festered, becoming a piece of local legend. She was the woman who had defied the richest man in the territory. He was the Apache who had stood with her. They were a walking provocation, and the air crackled with it. Their first stop was the mercantile. The bell above the door chimed with a sound that was both familiar and jarring. Inside, the air was still and thick with the usual smells, but the atmosphere was anything but Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour judgment. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, her voice loud enough for the two other customers in the store to hear. "Come back for your wedding dress." "Have you?" Eloise ignored the jibe, her gaze sweeping the shelves. "I need salt, Mrs. Gable, and bandages." The woman's eyes flicked to Naichi, who stood just inside the door, his presence filling the space, silent and watchful. "I'm surprised you'd show your face in a respectable establishment, especially with him." She lingered on the word, loading it with a world of disdain. "They say he looks like sin itself." Eloise turned from the shelves and met the woman's gaze directly. A few weeks ago, the comment would have flustered her, shamed her into silence. But the desert had baked away her deference. She had learned from a man who did not waste words, and she found she had few to waste herself. "Whatever sin you see is better than greed. Martha," she said, her voice calm and even. "Greed poisons the water." The other customers, a pair of ranch hands, stopped their conversation and stared. Misses. Gable's mouth opened and closed like a fish. No sound coming out. Eloise placed the sacks of salt and a roll of bandages on the counter next to a small pile of coins. The transaction was completed in a stunned, ringing silence. Their next stop was the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel was a constant, honest sound in a town full of whispers. Abel King was working at his anvil, his powerful body gleaming with sweat in the furnace's glow. He saw them approach and, with a quick glance around the empty street, jerked his head toward the rear of the smithy. Inside, away from prying eyes, the heat was even more intense. The air smelled of hot iron and coal smoke. Abel wiped his hands on a rag, his face grim, but his eyes clear and steady. "I heard you left," he said to Eloise. "Good. This is no place for you now. We cannot run forever." "Abel," she replied. "Barron is building a dam. He means to take the river." Abel's jaw tightened. He was a man of the town, but he was also a man of principle. "I know. I've seen the crews. They're working fast and sloppy." He looked from Eloise to Naichi. "What do you need?" Naichi spoke for the first time since they had entered the town. Expansion bolts, the kind used for anchoring in rock, and 50 feet of steel cable. Abel's eyebrows rose. He was a practical man. He understood the language of tools and their purpose. "That's not for building fences," he said, his voice low. "The dam is not yet finished," Naichi said. "It has not been inspected or approved. A structure that is not safe should not stand." Understanding dawned in the blacksmith's eyes. This was not a plan for mindless destruction. It was a calculated risk, aimed at forcing a halt, at using the rules of construction and safety against the man who was breaking them. It was a lever to pry open a crack in Barron's power. "Wait here," Abel said. He disappeared into a cluttered storeroom and returned a few minutes later with a heavy canvas sack. The items were wrapped in oilcloth. "No charge. Consider it my contribution to the town's well-being." He looked at Eloise, his expression serious. "Be careful. Barron's men are everywhere. They're drunk on the power he gives them." As if to prove his point, as they stepped back out into the blinding sunlight, 2 of Barron's mine guards blocked their path. One of them was the man who had pushed Eloise on the courthouse steps. A brutish grin split his face when he saw her. "Well, well, the runaway bride," he sneered, "and her red-skinned shadow. The boss has been looking for you." He took a step toward Eloise, his hand reaching for her arm. He never touched her. Naichi moved with a speed that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. He did not draw his knife. He did not throw a punch. He simply stepped between the man and Eloise, his left hand intercepting the man's wrist, his right hand cupping the man's elbow. There was a single, fluid motion, a turn, a lift, a precise application of leverage. The man's arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a sharp, agonized cry was torn from his throat. He dropped to his knees, his face white with shock and pain. Naichi held him there for a silent, terrible second. He did not look angry. His face was a mask of cold, disciplined control. He looked directly into the man's eyes, and the message was unmistakable. "I will not kill you, but I can unmake you. I can cause you a world of pain, and you will remember it." He released the man, who collapsed, cradling his arm and whimpering. The second guard, who had been reaching for his pistol, froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his gun. He looked at his partner on the ground, then at Naichi's calm, deadly stillness, and made a wise decision. He said nothing. Naichi simply turned and walked away, Eloise at his side, leaving the 2 men in the dust. The confrontation had been short, brutal, and utterly public. Their final task belonged to Eloise, alone. She walked into the county clerk's office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk, a balding man with ink stains on his fingers, peered at her over his spectacles. He recognized her immediately, and a flicker of fear crossed his face. "I am here to file a petition," Eloise said, her voice steady. She placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. She had spent the last 2 nights working on it, crafting the words with care. It was a formal complaint, citing territorial water rights that guaranteed access for all residents, and raising a legal challenge to the safety of an unapproved industrial construction upstream. It was a long shot, a flimsy shield against an avalanche, but it was something. It was a piece of paper that said she was still fighting, using the very laws they had twisted against her. The clerk read it, his hands trembling slightly. I cannot accept this. Judge Avery." "You are the county clerk," Eloise said, her voice firm. "Your job is to record public documents. This is a public document. If you refuse, you are obstructing justice." She leaned forward. "Silas Barron does not own this office. Not yet." The clerk swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, he took out his official stamp, inked it, and brought it down on the paper with a dull thud. He recorded the petition in his ledger, his pen scratching in the quiet room. He had done his duty. The moment she stepped outside, she knew the news of their return had reached the courthouse. The deputy was hurrying down the street, a warrant in his hand, a look of grim determination on his face. There was no time to think. Naichi grabbed her hand, and they ran. They dodged down an alley, their footsteps echoing between the buildings. They were fugitives now, not just by Barron's decree, but by the town's own law. They made it to the riverbank at the edge of town as dusk began to fall, hiding in a thicket of willows. They could see the lights of Coyote Bend coming on, a small, fragile constellation of lamps against the immense darkness of the desert. That night, something happened. A group of ranchers, riding in late, were the first to see it. They stopped their horses at the river crossing, their lanterns held high. The water, which should have been clear and shallow, was running thick and dark. A foul, sulphurous smell hung in the air. As they looked closer, they saw the source. The current was filled with the pale, upturned bellies of dead fish, hundreds of them, caught in the reeds and washing up on the muddy banks. Word spread through the town like a contagion. People came out of the saloon, out of their homes, carrying lanterns and torches. They gathered at the river's edge, staring in horrified silence at the trail of death flowing from the direction of Barron's dam. He had released a sluice of industrial sludge, a toxic byproduct of his construction, uncaring of the consequences downstream. The river was the town's life. It watered their stock, their small gardens. Some of them fished in it for their supper. Now, it was poisoned. The dead fish were a stark, undeniable symbol of Silas Barron's greed. They were proof that his ambition was a threat not just to a lone woman or a band of Apache, but to every single one of them. In the flickering lantern light, Eloise saw the faces of her neighbors. She saw their shock turn to a slow, simmering anger. The whispers were no longer about her. They were about the water, about their future. The public opinion, which had been a solid wall of fear and prejudice, was beginning to crack. The flight from Coyote Bend had stolen the last of Eloise's reserves. The days of relentless sun, the nights of cold fear, and the raw, draining tension of the confrontation had taken their toll. Huddled in the temporary shelter Naichi had fashioned from a canvas sheet and a low-hanging juniper, a deep chill began to set in. A cold that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was a fever, born of exhaustion and the brutal heat of their journey back to town. She tried to hide it, to clench her teeth against the shivers that racked her body, but she could hide nothing from him. He saw the unnatural brightness of her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands as she drew her thin shawl around her shoulders. He said nothing, but he moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that was more comforting than any words could have been. He left her side and returned a few minutes later with smooth, flat stones he had taken from the cool depths of the Rio Bonito. He placed one on her forehead, the touch of it a shocking, blessed relief against her burning skin. He placed another at the nape of her neck. He then built a small, almost smokeless fire and set a tin pot of water to boil. Into it, he shaved thin strips of bark from a willow branch. The bitter, medicinal scent of the brewing tea filled their small shelter. While it steeped, he took a heavy wool blanket, soaked it in the river until it was heavy with water, and draped it over the canvas, creating a space of cool, damp air that seemed to push back against the desert's lingering heat. He did all of this with a profound and respectful grace, his movements economical and sure. He cared for her not with fussy solicitude, but with a practical, knowledgeable competence that soothed her ragged nerves. He was a healer in his own right, his medicine the deep, ancient knowledge of the land itself. When the tea was ready, he poured it into a cup and held it out to her. She took it in both hands, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. The taste was bitter, but she drank it down, feeling its astringent heat spread through her. She lay back on the bed of soft pine needles he had made for her, and for the first time in days, the tight knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. They sat in silence as the last light of day bled from the sky and the stars emerged, hard and bright in the blackness. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the river a few yards away. "I was never truly afraid of dying," Eloise said, her voice a low, hoarse whisper in the quiet. The fever seemed to have burned away all pretense, leaving only the raw truth. Not in the mind collapse, not when I faced those men in town. My greatest fear, it is something else. She paused, gathering her thoughts. It is the thought of being erased, of having my choices taken from me until the person I am is gone. When Judge Avery spoke, when Barron made his offer, it felt like they were trying to steal my soul, to make me a possession, a name in a ledger, to lose the right to say no, to lose the right to choose your own path. That is a fate worse than any simple death. Nietzsche stared into the fire, his face a mask of shadow and flickering light. He let her words settle in the space between them before he spoke. His fear, she was learning, was of a different shape, but it ran just as deep. "My fear," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is to fail my people. I carry the weight of their trust. They look to me to make the right choices, to see the path through the darkness that our enemies create. If I choose wrong, if my pride or my anger leads us to ruin, then I have not just failed myself, I have dishonored the memory of my ancestors and stolen the future from our children. To be the one who breaks the braid, that is a fear my spirit would not survive." They were two people from two different worlds, their lives defined by entirely different loyalties, hers to her own fierce independence, his to the collective soul of his tribe. Yet, in that moment, their fears met and understood each other in the firelight. Both feared a kind of erasure, a loss of the essential self, whether by force or by failure. It was then that the sound came, drifting from across the river. It was the sound of drunken laughter, coarse and loud, followed by a slurred, jeering voice that cut through the night. "Hey, you hear about that Barron judge forced her to wed a rich baron she chose the Apache who looked like sin?" The words struck Eloise like a physical blow. She flinched, closing her eyes. It was her story, her humiliation twisted into a crude joke for the entertainment of men she would never know. The shame of it was a brand, a public declaration of her fall. The gossip had become a weapon, and it had found its mark even here, in this quiet sanctuary. Naichi's body went rigid, a low sound, like the growl of a cornered animal, rumbled in his chest. He started to rise, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "No," Eloise whispered, her hand finding his arm. "Do not! It is only words! They cannot hurt us here!" He subsided, but the stillness in him was now a coiled and dangerous thing. Eloise looked at him, at his proud, harsh profile illuminated by the fire. The cruel words echoed in her mind, but as she looked at the man beside her, they began to change their meaning. She had been a victim in the story the town told, but that was not the truth. She had made a choice. She spoke the words aloud, her voice raspy but clear. claiming them as her own. Judge forced her to wed a rich Barron. She chose the Apache who looked like sin. She turned her head on the pine needles to look at him fully. "If I had the choice to make again," she said, her voice finding a strength she did not know it possessed, "I would still choose the man who knows how to let me choose." The statement hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. It was more than gratitude, more than an alliance. It was a declaration, as binding as any vow spoken in a church. Naichi turned from the fire, his dark eyes searching hers. The anger had gone out of him, replaced by an emotion she could not name, something deep and powerful and humbling. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they brushed against her cheek and came to rest on her forehead. The gesture was both practical, a check on her fever, and exquisitely tender. His touch was a cool fire on her skin. "Your fever is less," he said, his voice a low whisper. He did not pull his hand away. "Eloise." It was the first time he had spoken her name. He leaned closer, his presence seeming to fill the small shelter, to push back the vast, empty darkness of the desert. The air was thick with the scent of sage and the faint, clean smell of his skin. "I will not touch you," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the sound of the river. "Until you wish it." It was a promise, a sacred vow delivered in the heart of the wilderness. It was the exact opposite of Silas Barron's possessive ambition. It was the gift of choice, the very thing she valued above all else. He drew his hand back and reached into a small leather pouch at his belt. He brought out a single, simple earring of hammered silver, adorned with a small, sky-blue piece of turquoise. It was old, worn smooth with time. "My mother made this," he said, his voice thick with an old and private grief. "She wore it always. I want you to hold it, not as a gift, as a sign of my trust in you." He did not place it in her hand, but set it carefully on the blanket beside her. It was not a claim, but an offering. He was trusting her with a piece of his past, a piece of his heart. As she looked from the earring to his solemn face, the air changed. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of distant rain and damp earth. A single drop of water landed on the canvas above them with a soft pat, then another and another. A light, misty rain, the first of the season, began to fall, a promise of life in the parched land, a symbol of hope. Eloise reached out and took the silver earring, its metal cool and solid in her palm. She closed her fingers around it. She looked at his hands, seeing the faint smudges of soot from the fire, just as her own were smudged with the dust and labor of the past weeks. They were bound not by promises, but by shared burdens, by the dirt and ash of a common fight. She sat up, the dizziness from her fever gone, replaced by a profound clarity, in the soft, flickering light of the fire, with the gentle sound of the rain whispering around them. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, her head resting on his chest. It was not the embrace of a lover, but something deeper, quieter. It was the embrace of two solitudes meeting in the vastness of the desert. Two people who had found in each other a place to finally, truly breathe. The quiet intimacy of their riverside camp did not last. Silas Barron was a man who did not tolerate loose ends, and the news of the poisoned river, which had turned a portion of the town against him, had only hardened his resolve. He did not see it as a mistake, but as an insult. Eloise's heart was no longer just a desirable object he wished to possess. She was a symbol of defiance, and he meant to crush her. New posters appeared all over Coyote Bend, printed on fresh, clean paper that stood out against the dusty, clapboard walls. The bounty for Eloise's return was doubled, but a new, chilling phrase was added to the description. She was to be brought back unharmed and intact for her wedding day. It was a public branding, a declaration that she was his property, and he was merely reclaiming what belonged to him. To provide a legal justification for his actions, Judge Avery issued a formal proclamation, citing the need to protect the security of a vital public works project. He forbade any gathering of Apache people within a 5-mile radius of the dam construction site. The order was a transparent lie, a legal wall built to isolate Nietzsche and his people, to paint them as a threat and justify whatever violence Barron's men chose to employ. The land itself seemed to grow restless under the weight of so much human avarice. The air grew thick and heavy, the sky taking on a strange, yellowish-brown tinge. The usual afternoon winds did not stir. Instead, a great and ominous stillness settled over the valley. Dola sniffed the air, her face etched with concern. "A great wind is coming," she said, her voice low. "The desert is angry." It began as a low moan in the distance, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Then, the horizon vanished, consumed by a roiling, monstrous wall of dust and sand. A sandstorm, not the playful dust devils that danced across the plains, but a true desert tempest, a force of raw, elemental power. Nietzsche and Taza moved with urgent, practiced speed, securing the wickiups, calming the horses, and gathering the children into the most sheltered lodges. The first gust of wind hit the valley like a physical blow, carrying with it a blinding, stinging torrent of sand that scoured the skin and choked the lungs. The world dissolved into a howling, chaotic twilight of grit and fury. The storm raged for hours. When its fury finally began to abate, and the thick brown air started to thin, the landscape was transformed. It was a world remade in dust, every surface coated, every familiar shape softened and strange. Taza, who had been keeping watch from a high vantage point, came sliding down the rocks, his face grim beneath a mask of dirt. "The dam," he said, his voice a hoarse shout against the dying wind. "The workers' camp. It is gone. The wind tore their shacks to pieces." Without a word, Nietzsche gathered a small group, Taza, a few other warriors, and Eloise. She did not hesitate. There were injured men, and she was a healer. It did not matter whose men they were. They found the site in a state of utter devastation. The flimsy wooden shanties that had served as the workers' barracks had been obliterated, reduced to a splintered wasteland of timber and twisted metal. The wind still howled through the canyon, whipping sand into their faces. Men were crawling from the wreckage, dazed and injured. A few lay frighteningly still. There was no debate, no discussion of enemies or allegiances. Nietzsche's party went to work. Nietzsche himself, with his immense strength, lifted a collapsed roof beam that had pinned a man's legs, while Taza and the others began pulling the wounded from the debris. Eloise moved from man to man, her bag of supplies open, her hands swift and sure. She set a broken arm, cleaned and bandaged a deep gash in a man's scalp, and pressed a compress against a wound in a young man's side that was bleeding badly. The men they were saving stared at them with a mixture of fear, shock, and dawning disbelief. These were the savages they had been warned against, the very people they were helping to displace. And now, these same people were saving their lives, moving through the chaos with a calm courage that stood in stark contrast to the panic and neglect of their own bosses. No foreman was present, no one from Barron's company. The workers had been left to the mercy of the storm. Eloise was kneeling beside a young miner, barely a man, his face pale with shock. He had a nasty cut on his leg, and as she was wrapping it, he grabbed her arm. His eyes were wide with a feverish intensity. "You have to know," he whispered, his voice raspy. "The dam, it's a sham." "Be still," Eloise said gently. "You have lost blood." "No, you have to listen," he insisted, his grip tightening. "Barron, he bought cheap dynamite. Condemned stock from a mine back east. It is unstable. We have had misfires all week." He coughed, a dry, dusty sound. "And the foundation. We poured the footings on loose shale. The foreman told us to just keep pouring, to fill the hollows with gravel and hide it with concrete. It's rotten at the core. A strong flood will take the whole thing down. He is building a tomb." The boy's confession, torn from him by the terror of the storm and the unexpected kindness of his rescuers, was the piece of the puzzle they had been missing. It was not just a matter of water rights or illegal construction. The dam was a death trap, a monument to Barron's greed that threatened to wash away everything downstream, including Coyote Bend itself. They helped the last of the injured to a makeshift shelter, leaving them with water and a fire. As they prepared to leave, a new threat appeared. A wagon, pulled by two hard-driven horses, came rattling down the dry riverbed that led away from the valley. It was a group of bounty hunters, 4 of them, their faces hard and cruel. They had used the chaos of the storm to push deeper into the territory than they had dared before. And they were not alone. Tied in the back of the wagon, her small face streaked with tears and dirt, was Mika. A cold, pure rage, unlike anything she had ever known, washed over Eloise. They had taken the child. They were using her as bait. Naiche saw it at the same moment. The calm discipline in his face vanished, replaced by the lethal focus of a striking hawk. He and Taza exchanged a single, flinty glance and melted into the rocks on either side of the wash. The bounty hunters saw Eloise and spurred their horses, a triumphant whoop rising from the driver. They thought they had her trapped. But Eloise was not the same woman who had stumbled from the courthouse. She scrambled up the rocky side of the canyon, calling out to them, "Let her go, it's me you want." It was a foolish, desperate act, meant only to draw their attention. As the wagon thundered toward her, Naiche's horse shot out from behind a rock outcropping, not to attack the wagon, but to race alongside it. He rode low, a fluid extension of his animal, drawing the fire of the man with the rifle. The shots went wide. From the other side of the wash, Taza rose and fired a single arrow. It did not strike a man. It struck the horse's harness, slicing through a thick leather strap. The led horse on the right stumbled, its stride broken, throwing the wagon into a lurching skid. At that moment, from a ridge overlooking the whole scene, came the sharp, unmistakable crack of a heavy-caliber rifle. It was not Apache. It was Abel King. He had followed them, fearing they would need him. The bullet, fired with the precision of a master smith who understood the breaking point of metal, struck the iron rim of the wagon's front wheel. The wheel shattered, wood and metal exploding outward. The wagon slewed violently and tipped, spilling the men and the child into the sand. Chaos erupted. Eloise half ran, half slid down the embankment, her only thought for Mika. She scooped the crying terrified child into her arms, shielding her with her own body. Naiche was off his horse, his knife in his hand, engaging the driver who had come up with a pistol. The fight was short and brutal. Taza and Abel kept the other 2 pinned down with suppressive fire from the rocks. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, their wagon crippled, the bounty hunters broke and ran, scrambling away into the desert. In the aftermath, as Mika sobbed quietly in her arms, Eloise found what she was looking for. A stick of the cheap dynamite had fallen from the wagon, its paper casing oily, its fuse looking frayed and unreliable. The young miner's testimony was no longer just words. She now had proof. They needed more. The next day, guided by the miner's whispered directions, Eloise and Naiche slipped back to the deserted dam site. The place was a wreck, but the foundations were visible where the storm had washed away the loose topsoil. The shoddy workmanship was terrifyingly obvious. Great cracks were already visible in the new concrete, and she could see where they had poured it directly over loose rock and gravel. A new ally, the town schoolteacher, a quiet man named Elias who believed in facts and truth, had provided them with his most prized possession, a bulky, wooden box camera. He had been horrified by the story of the poisoned river and had offered his help. Eloise, her hands surprisingly steady, positioned the camera and took 3 clear, damning photographs of the dam's rotten core. She now had a ledger of evidence, the miner's testimony, which Elias had carefully written down and had the boy sign, the sample of the faulty dynamite, and the irrefutable proof of the photographs. It was a case built not on opinion, but on fact. As they rode away from the dam site, the wind picked up again, whipping at her clothes and hair. She was covered from head to toe in a fine layer of dust, her face smudged, her dress the color of the earth itself. She must have looked a sight. She glanced at Naichi, who was riding silently beside her, his own face a stoic mask of dust. "That sin you spoke of," he said, his voice completely deadpan, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "The one the woman in the store saw. Perhaps it is a sin of vanity to use so much face powder." A choked laugh escaped Eloise's throat. It was a ridiculous, wonderful, perfectly timed observation. In the midst of their flight, with the weight of so much danger on their shoulders, the simple, dry humor was a lifeline. The dust of the storm had settled, but it had not buried them. It had only revealed the truth. The evidence was a heavy, dangerous weight in their possession. They had the photographs, the testimony, the stick of faulty dynamite. They had the truth. But Silas Barron was not a man who waited for the truth to have its day in court. He was a man who acted, who snuffed out inconvenient lights before anyone else could see by them. His response was swift, brutal, and absolute. The fire started late at night. It was not the blacksmith's forge, a place of stone and iron that would be difficult to burn. He chose a softer, more symbolic target. The flames that lit up the night sky rose from the small wooden building that housed the town's school and Elias, the teacher's modest living quarters. The fire consumed the books, the slates, the carefully transcribed testimony of the young miner, and the spare photographic plates. It was an attack on knowledge itself, an attempt to reduce the evidence to ash and smoke. But the fire was only a diversion. Under the cover of the chaos, as the townsfolk formed a feudal bucket brigade, Barron's men moved. They did not go after Eloise or Naichi, who were miles away in the foothills. They went for the heart of the town's conscience. They went for Abel King. They took him from his forge, a swift and violent abduction that left his tools scattered and a dark stain on the hard-packed earth. The message came the next morning, delivered by a grim-faced rancher who had been paid a gold coin to ride out and find them. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Abel King was being held at the dam. He would be released only when Eloise Hart presented herself there, ready to become Mrs. Silas Barron. The wedding would take place on the crest of the dam itself, a grand spectacle of ownership. If she refused, or if any attempt at rescue was made, Abel would be thrown from the top of the unfinished structure. The deadline was noon the following day. The ultimatum was a masterstroke of cruelty, turning their friend and ally into a hostage, his life the price of her freedom. There was no room to maneuver, no time to appeal to a higher authority. Barron had created his own brutal court, and he was the judge, jury, and executioner. That night, in the cool darkness of a hidden canyon, Naichi and Taza worked by the light of a shielded fire. They unwrapped the steel cable and the expansion bolts Abel had given them. This was their only chance, a desperate gamble that relied on precision, not brute force. "We cannot destroy the dam," Taza said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "To do so would kill the men working there, and perhaps even the people in the town if the flood is too great." "We will not destroy it," Naichi said, running his hand along the cold, smooth length of the cable. "We will use Barron's own greed against him." The boy said the foundation was poured on loose shale. "It is hollow." He picked up one of the heavy steel bolts, its mechanism designed to expand once set inside a drilled hole. "We will not break the wall. We will pull its teeth. We will anchor the cable to the bedrock below the footings and attach it to the main sluice gate anchor. We will not use explosives. We will use tension. We will create a crack, just enough to release the water's pressure in a controlled way, enough to show everyone that the foundation is rotten, enough to stop a wedding." It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a piece of engineering sabotage that required a surgeon's touch. They were not planning a demolition, they were planning a demonstration. The next day dawned with a sky the color of pale ash. The scene at the dam was a grotesque parody of a wedding celebration. At the center of the wide, curved crest of the concrete structure, a space had been cleared. Silas Barron stood waiting. dressed in a fine black suit, a triumphant smile on his handsome face. Beside him, looking pale and sweating in the morning heat, was Judge Horace Avery, holding a Bible with trembling hands. Abel King stood nearby, his hands bound in front of him, 2 armed guards at his side. His face was bruised, but his eyes were filled with a defiant fire. And then Eloise arrived. She had not come as a bride, but as a sacrifice. She wore her simple, dusty dress, her hair pulled back, her face composed in a mask of cold resolve. She walked between 2 more of Barron's men, her head held high. As she reached the top of the dam, a murmur went through the 20 or so construction workers who had been ordered to assemble to witness the event. They were a sullen, resentful audience, their loyalty to Barron already eroded by the storm and his subsequent abandonment of them. "Ah, the bride arrives," Barron said, his voice booming with false cheer. "A bit underdressed for the occasion, my dear, but we shall remedy that soon enough." He took her arm, his grip like iron. "Let us begin. Judge," as Avery opened his Bible and began to stammer through the opening words of the ceremony. 2 shadows were moving silently along the base of the dam, hidden from view. Nietzsche and Taza had already set the expansion bolts deep into the canyon's bedrock. Now, they were attaching the steel cable to the massive iron pilings that anchored the main sluice gate mechanism to the dam's foundation. The very foundation the young miner had called rotten. Using a system of levers and pulleys, they began to apply a slow, steady, relentless tension. On top of the dam, Barron was growing impatient with Avery's fumbling. "Get on with it, man." Eloise stared out at the valley, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had to believe in Nietzsche. She had to believe in their plan. It was then that Nietzsche chose his moment. He did not appear with a weapon. He simply walked out from behind a large piece of construction equipment at the far end of the dam, his hands empty and open at his sides. Taza remained hidden, continuing to apply pressure to the cable. Baron Nietzsche's voice was not a shout, but it carried with a clear, commanding authority that cut through Avery's nervous muttering. Every head turned toward him. Barron's face contorted with rage. "Kill him!" he shrieked at his men. But before they could raise their rifles, Nietzsche spoke again, his words directed not at Barron, but at the crew of watching workers. "This man has lied to you," he called out. "This dam is built on a foundation of greed and rotten rock. The dynamite he gave you is faulty. The concrete you poured is hollow. He is not building a future for this valley. He is building a tomb, and your names will be on it when it fails." A low, angry murmur rippled through the workers. They had seen the shoddy materials, felt the unstable ground. Nietzsche was speaking a truth they already knew in their bones. Barron's composure finally broke. His handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of fury. He released Eloise, drew a pistol from his coat, and grabbed her again, shoving the cold muzzle of the gun against her temple. "One more step, and she dies," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I own this dam, I own this valley, and I own her." Nietzsche stopped. He slowly raised his empty hands. He had thrown down his knife as he walked out, a clear sign that he had not come for a fight of blood, but of words. "Your ownership is a lie, Barron," he said, his voice calm and steady, "and a lie cannot hold back a river forever." At that exact moment, a deep, groaning sound came from the base of the dam, a sound of immense pressure and tortured stone. A spider web of cracks radiated outward from the main sluice gate. A trickle of water became a spurt, then a jet. The steel cable, pulled to its breaking point, had not snapped. It had pulled the faulty anchor piling straight out of the crumbling concrete. The dam did not explode. It tore. A huge section of the wall near the base gave way with a deafening roar, and a torrent of brown, muddy water and debris surged into the canyon below. The crest of the dam shuddered, a violent tremor that threw everyone off their feet. In the chaos, Barron lost his grip on Eloise. Nietzsche lunged, not at Barron, but at her, shoving her away from the crumbling edge, shielding her with his body as a secondary section of the parapet collapsed. The steel cable, now free of its tension, whipped through the air like a striking snake. It caught Naichi around the waist, the sudden force of it dragging him backward, over the newly created precipice. He cried out, his hands scrabbling for a hold, his body dangling over the churning water below, held only by the cruel bite of the cable. The community, which had been a scattered collection of individuals, became one. The workers, seeing their boss's true colors and their own lives in peril, surged forward. Two of them threw ropes down toward Naichi. Others grabbed Barron, who was trying to scramble for a horse, his face a mask of terror. Judge Avery, seeing all was lost, simply fled, disappearing in the confusion. Abel King, forgotten by his guards in the panic, saw his chance. With a powerful wrench of his shoulders, he snapped the cheap rope binding his wrists. He grabbed a fallen axe from a pile of tools and with a single, mighty swing, chopped through the ropes that bound his ankles. He was free. The scene was one of controlled chaos. The workers subdued the last of Barron's loyal guards. Elias, the schoolteacher, who had arrived with a group of concerned townsfolk, raised his box camera, the lens an unblinking eye, and captured the moment of justice. Silas Barron, the great railroad baron, held fast in the mud by the very men he had betrayed. The outdoor trial had begun, its verdict delivered by the people. But Naichi was still in peril. The cable was cinched tight around his waist, cutting into him, and the ropes the men had thrown were just out of his reach. The crumbling concrete he was clinging to was giving way. Eloise's mind went cold and clear. The fear was gone, replaced by the focused calm of a healer in a crisis. She saw the problem. The cable was snagged on a heavy iron clamp that was bolted to the remaining structure. If she could release the clamp, the cable would slacken, and the men could pull him up. She crawled across the vibrating concrete, ignoring the shouts of the men. She reached the clamp. The bolt was rusted, impossible to turn by hand. Her eyes darted around, searching. She saw a long iron pry bar lying nearby. It was heavy, too heavy, but she dragged it with her. Gritting her teeth, she wedged the end of the bar into the clamp's mechanism. She threw all of her weight against it, her muscles screaming in protest. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of protesting metal, the clamp sprang open. The cable went slack. Naichi, freed from its deadly grip, was able to get a firm hold on the ropes. A dozen hands, the hands of miners and ranchers and Apache warriors, pulled together, and he was hauled over the edge, back to safety. He collapsed onto the concrete, gasping for air, the deep, raw groove of the cable visible on his shirt. Eloise rushed to his side. He looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw, unspoken emotion. She had not panicked. She had not frozen. In the moment of ultimate crisis, she had saved him. The hero had needed rescuing, and she had been the one to answer the call. The return to Coyote Bend was quiet, almost somber. The fury of the climax had given way to a profound and heavy weariness. They brought with them Silas Barron and his few remaining loyal men, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of sullen anger and disbelief. The town met them not with cheers or triumphant shouts, but with a grave, watchful silence. The raw, violent justice of the dam had been a necessary fever, and now, in its aftermath, the community was left weak and reflective, contemplating the sickness that had been purged from its system. The first sound that greeted them was not the chatter of the crowd or the clatter of horses, but the slow, steady tolling of the church bell. It was Sunday. The sound, which usually marked the simple passage of time, now felt different. It was not a call to judgment, but a summons to reckon with what they had become, and what they might yet be. The small clapboard church was filled to overflowing. People stood in the aisles and crowded the open doorway. The Apache contingent, led by Naichi and Taza, were not made to stand in the back. The townsfolk, in a silent, collective act of repentance, made room for them in the pews. Reverend Michael, a man whose sermons usually focused on hellfire and damnation, looked out over his strange, united flock, and his face was filled not with fire, but with a deep and humbling sorrow. "We are taught to pray for deliverance from our enemies," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "But today, I ask you to pray for something more difficult. I ask you to pray for the victims of the dam, and I ask you to remember that we were all its victims." He looked from the faces of the miners to the weathered faces of the ranchers, and his gaze rested for a moment on Dola and her people. We were victims of our own fear, victims of our own silence. We allowed greed to poison our water, and we allowed prejudice to poison our hearts. We looked at our neighbors, and we saw strangers. We saw threats, and in our blindness, we nearly allowed our whole community to be washed away. A heavy silence filled the church. Then a man stood up. It was Mr. Henderson, a cattle rancher known for his hard opinions and his even harder disposition. He turned, not to the preacher, but to face Nietzsche directly. "I was wrong," Henderson said, his voice rough but clear. "Carrying to every corner of the church. My family has ranched this land for 2 generations. We thought it was ours. We were wrong. I apologize. For my ignorance, for my fear." He gave a stiff, formal nod. "You saved our town. We are in your debt." It was as if a dam of a different kind had broken. Another man stood, then a woman, their voices joining in a chorus of quiet, heartfelt apologies. They were not grand speeches, just simple, honest words of regret for things said and unsaid, for suspicions harbored and kindnesses withheld. A few old grumblers in the back pew began to mutter, but a sharp look from Mrs. Gable, of all people, silenced them instantly. The community was healing itself, one painful, honest word at a time. The next day, the law arrived in the form of a federal marshal, a tall, grim man with cold blue eyes who looked as if he had seen every form of human depravity and was impressed by none of it. A preliminary hearing was convened in the courthouse, the same room where Eloise's life had been so casually bartered away. The atmosphere now was utterly different. It was a place of solemn, official purpose. The marshal listened impassively as the charges were read. Then he looked at the evidence. The first person to speak was the county clerk, the balding man who had once trembled before Judge Avery. Today, he stood tall. "Before we proceed with the events of yesterday, Marshal," the clerk said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "I must present a document filed legally with this office 2 days prior." He produced Eloise's petition. The marshal read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked at Eloise with a new respect. She had not resorted to violence first. She had tried to use the law. The document, the marshal later noted, established a clear pattern of legal challenge that preceded the dam's collapse, shifting the narrative from one of vigilante action to one of self-defense against a criminal enterprise. Then came Elias, the schoolteacher, his quiet dignity a powerful counterpoint to the drama. He presented the signed testimony of the young miner. He presented the stick of oily, unstable dynamite. And finally, with the care of a priest handling a sacred relic, he presented the glass plate photographs. He held them up one by one for the marshal and the assembled citizens to see the irrefutable, damning proof of the cracks, the hollow spaces, the foundation of pure, criminal negligence. A collective gasp went through the room. The marshal's verdict was swift. He issued formal, federal warrants for the arrest of Silas Barron on charges of fraud, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy. He issued another warrant for the fugitive Horace Avery on charges of judicial corruption and conspiracy. The local law had failed, but the federal law had teeth. In the days that followed, the town began to find its new shape. Abel King, his arm in a sling but his spirit unbroken, was lauded as a hero. He just shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "A man's got to stand for something," he mumbled, "or the whole works will collapse." Elias became the town's official historian, the quiet keeper of the truth, his camera now a revered object. A lawyer arrived on the noon train, a slick man from the east with a polished briefcase and an air of condescending authority. He represented Barron's vast financial interests. He found Eloise at the doctor's office, where she had resumed her duties, tending to the injured, including the very men who had once worked for her tormentor. "Miss Hart," the lawyer said, his voice a smooth purr, "my client is prepared to be generous, a significant sum of money, enough to allow you to relocate anywhere you wish, to live a life of comfort, in exchange for your silence. Of course, a simple agreement to drop all testimony." Eloise finished tying a bandage around a miner's bruised hand and looked up at the lawyer. Her face was calm. Her eyes were clear. "Tell Mr. Barron," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding, "that my silence was never for sale, and my freedom is not a commodity to be purchased." The lawyer, for the first time in what was likely a long and successful career, was speechless. The town council, with the mayor now a chastened and far more attentive public servant, convened a meeting to discuss the future of the river. It was decided that a new, smaller, and safer diversion would be built, not a dam, and it would be managed by a community water board. The mayor, in a public act of humility, formally invited Nietzsche to sit on that board, to represent the interests and the ancestral water rights of his people. Nietzsche's acceptance was a single, dignified nod. He would not be a supplicant, but a partner. The final healing came in the most unlikely of places, the mercantile. Eloise had gone in to buy thread. The store was busy, but a hush fell as she entered. "Mrs." Gable stood behind her counter, her face flushed. She wrung her hands in her apron, a gesture of profound nervousness. "Eloise," she began, her voice cracking slightly. That thing I said, about Mr. Nietzsche, about him looking like, well, it was a wicked thing to say. I was wrong. I am sorry." The confession, so public and so heartfelt, hung in the air. The whole store was waiting to see how Eloise would respond. Eloise looked at the flustered woman, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. The bitterness was gone, washed away by the river and the rain. "You were right in a way." "Martha," Eloise said, her voice warm and touched with a gentle humor. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "It truly is a sin." She paused, letting the tension build, before adding with a twinkle in her eye, "The sin of being handsome and useful. It is a terrible burden for a man to bear." For a second, the store was silent. Then, a rancher in the back let out a great bark of laughter. The sound broke the tension like a window shattering. Soon, the entire store was filled with laughter, a warm, rolling, communal sound. Even Mrs. Gable cracked a smile, her shoulders slumping in relief. It was the sound of forgiveness. It was the sound of a town finding its way back to itself. A week after the fall of the dam, the Rio Bonito ran clean again. The foul sludge from Barron's construction had washed away, and the late-season rains had cleansed the riverbed, leaving the water clear and cool as it tumbled over the smooth stones. They stood on the same bank where she had shivered with fever, in the same spot where he had offered her his trust in the form of a silver earring. The air was different now. The tension was gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a long and terrible storm. The world felt new, washed clean. Eloise reached into the small pocket of her dress and brought out the earring. It felt warm from her body, the silver smooth against her palm, the turquoise a small, perfect piece of sky. She held it out to him on her open hand. "You gave me this to hold in trust," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I was a fugitive then, and you were a stranger. You showed me a kindness I did not expect, and you asked for nothing but the truth in return." She looked from the earring in her hand to his dark, solemn eyes. "The trust is fulfilled. You are safe among your people, and I am no longer running. This belongs to your family. It belongs to your past. It is time I returned it." Nietzsche looked at the earring resting on her palm, the small, precious object that represented so much of their journey. He did not take it. He simply looked at it, and then his gaze rose to meet hers. He had seen her face fear and rage and exhaustion. He had seen her find her courage and her strength. Now, he saw a quiet, steady light in her eyes that had not been there before. It was the light of a woman who knew her own worth, a woman who was finally, truly free. Slowly, he reached out, but his fingers did not close around the earring. Instead, he gently took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her palm. With his other hand, he picked up the piece of silver and turquoise. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would put it away, that their separate paths were now set to begin. But he did not put it away. He leaned forward, and with an incredible gentleness, he fastened the silver hook into the lobe of her ear. The cool metal was a startling, intimate touch against her skin. He did not release her hand. He held it, his touch a warm and steady anchor. "Stay, Eloise," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble that was for her alone. "Do not stay for me. Do not stay because of any debt you feel you owe. Stay because you have chosen yourself. Here, on this land that has tested you and shown you your own strength." He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw in them a vulnerability she had never seen before, a profound and open honesty that took her breath away. "And if you wish it, choose me as well." It was not a demand. It was not a plea. It was an offering, the most precious one he could give. It was the gift of a choice, laid at her feet without condition, without expectation. He was giving her the one thing the world had tried so hard to take from her. She did not need to think. She did not need to weigh her options. Her heart had known the answer long before the question was ever asked. The word was a simple, quiet exhalation of breath, a release of all the doubt and fear she had carried for so long. "Yes," she said. The word was a promise, a beginning. She raised her free hand and laid it against his cheek, the rough texture of his skin familiar and dear to her. "Yes," she said again, her voice stronger this time, filled with a joy so pure and fierce it felt like sunlight spreading through her veins. Their wedding was not a thing of law or religion. It was a thing of the earth and the community that had been forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. There was no white dress, no solemn judge, no building made of wood and nails. Their cathedral was the open sky, their witnesses the silent, watching mountains and the people who had become their family. Dola, her face a mask of serene happiness, came forward. In her hands, she did not carry a ring of gold or silver. She held a simple, beautiful circlet of braided leather. Eloise recognized the pattern, the 3 perfect strands woven together. "Family," Dola said, her voice soft as she placed the braid gently into Eloise's hand. "Land and freedom." Eloise took the braid and, with her own hands, tied it around Nietzsche's wrist. He, in turn, took her hand and tied a matching braid around her own. It was a bond, not of ownership, but of partnership, a tangible symbol of the values they would build their life upon. As they stood there, hand in hand, a group of the elder women began to sing. It was not a hymn from a church book, but a song that was much older. A melody that spoke of the river, of the turning of the seasons, of the resilience of a people who had endured. The music was soft, weaving itself into the gentle whisper of the wind through the cottonwood trees. Mika, her face alight with a radiant, unrestrained joy, darted forward, her small hands full of the wild yellow flowers that grew along the riverbank. She tossed them into the air, and the bright petals rained down upon them, a spontaneous, beautiful confetti. Taza stood nearby, his arms crossed, a rare, faint smile touching his lips. He leaned over to Abel King, who was watching the scene with a look of immense satisfaction. "Well," Taza said, his voice the familiar dry deadpan, "from now on, Nietzsche has someone to make him take his medicine on time." A year passed, the seasons turned, and the scars on the land and the people began to fade. The new Coyote Bend was a quieter, more thoughtful place, the community water board. With Nietzsche as a respected and essential member, managed the river's flow with a fairness and wisdom that benefited everyone, from the smallest farm to the most distant Apache encampment. Abel King's forge was busier than ever. His honesty and skill had made him the most sought-after blacksmith in the territory, and he had taken on 2 young apprentices. Elias, the schoolteacher, had converted a small storeroom into a proper photographic studio. He was no longer just a teacher. He was the town's memory, his clear, honest portraits and landscapes capturing the truth of their lives, ensuring that the real story of Coyote Bend would never be lost to lies or forgotten in the dust. The love between Eloise and Naichi was like the desert itself, quiet, resilient, and possessed of a stark, wild beauty. It was not a love of grand pronouncements or flowery poems. It was a love built on the solid bedrock of mutual respect, a love expressed in the shared work of their days and the quiet comfort of their nights. It was the freedom to be themselves, together. They learned that a person's dignity was not a thing to be earned or proven. It was an innate, unassailable truth. And they learned that freedom was not the absence of bonds, but the power to choose them. One evening, as the sun began to set, they rode their horses to the top of the mesa, the same place where he had first shown her the valley. They sat together, watching the long shadows stretch across the land, the sky turning a fiery orange and a deep, bruised purple. The air was cool and clean. A lone horse whinnied in the distance, a peaceful, contented sound. Below them, the lights of Coyote Bend and the soft glow of the Apache campfires began to appear. 2 separate communities now bound by a shared history and a common future. The great choking clouds of red dust that had once defined this land were gone. In the soft light of the setting sun, all that remained was a thin, rosy veil on the horizon, a gentle memory of the passions and the prejudices that had finally, blessedly, settled. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We invite you to share where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Tales, liking the video, and pressing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.